Hey everyone, I'm Paul Muller, the host of the AI Forecast, a weekly podcast sponsored by the great folks at Cloudera, where we explore the past, the present, and the future of data and AI in the enterprise, along with a host of industry-leading companies and experts. And today we're going to talk a bit about big data. Well, okay, so this is an interesting one. Researching the show, I thought, big data, when did we first start talking about that term? And depending on where you get your facts from, so I Googled it, as all good modern digital folks should. I probably should chat GPT it, shouldn't I? Anyway, the term is argued to have first been used back in 1943, just shortly after the Second World War ended. We could go into the history of it, but more credibly, it was being used actively around the 1990s. But for most of us, certainly in the IT world, it really came into use about 20 years ago. 2005 is sort of considered to be the time that it became popularized, along with the term data scientist, which, when you think about it, is kind of an eternity ago in technology terms. But far from being yesterday's news, I would argue that big data has only really just hit the mainstream in terms of adoption, and market growth figures back that up. 15% compound growth in the big data segment year on year. So businesses, some businesses at least anyway, are only just waking up to the value that comes from tapping into more of their data, which I found personally quite surprising. Well, to get his take on the state of play of the big data space, we're joined by author and industry consultant Jan-Willem Middleburg. In addition to being the author of both the Service Automation Framework and the Enterprise Big Data Framework, he's the founder of the consulting firm Cybiant, as well as host of the Big Data Talks, podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Jan.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks for the kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be on your show today. I sincerely look forward to discussing all of the topics that we just mentioned.
Now, I've got to apologize for dragging you out of bed somewhat early because unlike some of our other guests who are based in Europe or the United States or even Australia, you're based in KL, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, so that's a wonderful place to live. I think I'm literally on the other side of the planet from where you are today.
Well, no, I'm actually recording from Australia, so I'm a lot closer than you realize.
Oh, that's much closer, absolutely.
If I stand up and wave, you'll be able to see me. Hey, look, before we jump into the topic of big data, and we might even talk a little bit about service automation and agentic technology, because we're hearing more and more about that every day. We do a little thing to sort of get us warmed up, the Fast Four. Are you ready to play the game?
I'm absolutely ready for it.
All right, excellent. Well, you're Dutch, so we should be able to have a bit of fun with this. So, first question, what would people say is your superpower?
My superpower is the ability to explain simple concepts or difficult concepts in simple terms. I think that's one of my main key areas of expertise.
Let's put it to the test today. Next up, the most impactful technology of all time?
Well, that's an interesting question, but I think if I were to choose, it's probably the science of time, horology as it's called, and being able to synchronize time all across the world. A lot of people don't realize how important time is in computer systems, and the fact that we can now synchronize that all across the world, I think, is one of the most impactful inventions. I know a lot of your other guests are probably going to say AI, so I thought I'll do something different for this.
No, I love it. So if I wanted to talk to you about the network time protocol, you could geek out with me for a while.
Well, I think you need another hour.
Well, the good news is we'd be able to keep track of the time. All right. What would you like to, speaking of AI, what would you like to see AI automate for you personally in the future? We talk about everything that it can do for businesses and everyone else, but what do you, when you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh, I only wish AI would do this for me?
I would say the scheduling of the everyday tasks. So ordering of the groceries, making sure that the calendars are being updated, the batteries are ordered in time, so I'm never there in need of replacing things. I have 2 children who use an amazing amount of toys, and I'm always short on those kinds of things. So that's kind of like one of those small frustrations in life that I would love AI to come up with a solution for.
I think that's a superb answer. And last but not least, I always feel like I have to explain this question, which makes me feel like maybe the question's not so good. But and maybe this is the whole point of the exercise. And when we get to talking about enterprise big data, the reason behind the question becomes self-evident. But I figured out, especially talking to younger people, especially straight out of university, talking to them, giving them, guidance or coaching on their careers, it becomes apparent to me very quickly that I have a couple of hacks that I use when it comes to working with data personally that just help me become a more effective executive. I triangulate subconsciously. I don't even think about it. I'm always going to get 2 or 3 different sources of data to make sure that confirmation bias isn't creeping in to the rest. But as I say, it's not like I think, I don't want to have confirmation bias. I just subconsciously do it.
Yeah.
What are some of the best practices or hacks you've learned as someone working with data throughout your career?
There's a lot of best practices, but I think one of the most important part is to really be critical and really verify the sources of your truth. And I think that's a really critical thing. And as you just mentioned, having independent verification of the facts that you're actually looking at. One of the big challenges of our time, especially now in this whole era of AI, is being able to trust what you're seeing. And having independent verification across a spectrum of different sources and being able to actually trust and being fully convinced of the information that you're looking at, I think that's one of the key best practices that every data professional should take into consideration.
Couldn't agree with you more. I've been on record on a previous podcast as saying that we live in the post-trust era.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of phrasing it.
It's yeah, and I actually think it's probably the biggest problem of the next, I'd say, 20, 30 years. It could be the thing that creates an issue in society that we'll be talking about 100 years from now. But we can get to that topic later. Maybe you and I can talk about it on your podcast.
I trust we will.
I'm sure we will. All right, hey, let's jump forward because you and I have a bit of a shared background. Tell us about how you came to be in KL and writing a book about enterprise big data.
I started my career back in the Netherlands, where I'm originally from. So that's where I started. And I started with a company called Pink Elephant, which is a company that's very big in the space of IT services and service management and that area. And in around 2016, they asked me to become the VP for Asia. So I took over and they had their head office here in Malaysia. So that's the whole reason I moved over to this side of the world. And after that assignment, I kind of really liked it. And I wanted to really go into this whole domain of data science, big data. That's always been one of my big areas of interest. And one of the main thing, and this kind of might be a bit of the bridge towards the topic that we're going to discuss today, is I grew up with frameworks and a lot of best practices and how do you do things. And I very quickly realized when we were doing assignments for consulting company or for consulting for companies that something like that really didn't exist in the data space. And I always wondered why. Why is there no framework for how do you use data effectively? Why is there no methodology for organizations that aim to become more data-driven or that would like to set up a data science department or anything related? And basically, that's the inspiration for creating the Enterprise Big Data Framework, which is kind of one of my core publications. Because what I really aspire to do is get some structure to that whole data science and big data domain. So that's kind of like the way that things originated and how my background led to where we are today.
Look, I really love it. I was actually preparing for today's podcast. I was, number one, reminiscing about the folks at Pink Elephant. I think you and I know some folks in common. And we're talking going back 20 plus years now, weirdly enough, to the time that big data just started to become a thing.
Yeah.
I was wondering how much of that was your inspiration, because the IT infrastructure library, which is one of the things we're speaking about, was a set of processes and procedures, arguably, that was sort of driven originally by the British government, but became popularized in Europe and then the world. And the problem they were trying to solve, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that everyone was doing service management, things like help desk, problem root cause identification, change management. Everyone was doing it, but they had different names for the same thing. So we had a communication problem. They were often reinventing processes with varying degrees of efficacy, of effectiveness. And then as a result, there was a lot of wasted effort going into defining what was largely people doing exactly the same things, but in a different way, which meant training and certification and standards were almost impossible to create, which meant it was more of craftsmanship than it was an industrialized process. How did I go?
I think, Paul, you still have all your ITIL terminology straight up.
But to your point, I suppose big data 2030, and let's think about it. So ITIL really sort of came into its own, 20, 30 years after a lot of the mainframe and help desk systems were invented. So it kind of took a little while to percolate before there was enough, I suppose, prior art to draw on where you could say, well, actually, you know what? We've all been experimenting for the last 20 years, but there's a handful of ways of doing this well that are going to be successful enough for enough people that if you're just getting started, this is a great place to make you productive quickly, cost effectively, and consistently. Is it fair to say that was some of the inspiration for the enterprise big data framework?
Absolutely, and building this community of practitioners that would like to share knowledge and advance that framework further. So what I really tried to do when I authored the framework is consult with a lot of industry experts, people who are, for instance, leading minds in domains like data governance and data management, but also the ethical part and data architecture. So what I really try to do is bring together some of those best practices and come up with a standardized way of doing things. And the funny part is that I actually learned a lot of that whole exercise myself. It took me close to 2.5 years to write the full book. So it's I could fairly say that there's a considerable amount of effort into the whole publication. But having those one-on-one chats with those industry experts and the community that we kind of then build around that, we have them as now listed as ambassadors in our program. That really helps to evolve the framework. And that's the whole point. I wanted to make sure that every organization that has the question, how do I become more data-driven? How can I use my data better for smarter, more intelligent, faster decisions? The key area that everyone is talking about these days. How can we present them with a set of practices, guidelines, procedures to basically say, well, here is a blueprint. Take whatever you like from this framework, but it will help you expedite data-driven decision-making. And maybe just to kind of go one step deeper, the underlying belief of why I think that this should be done is that if you make decisions basically in everything in life, whether it's your personal life or whether it's in business, in almost all cases, data-driven decisions are so much better than just a hunch or something that you read a few weeks ago. So if you have that capacity and capability to consistently make data-driven decisions, then whether it's in business or in your personal life, you will always outperform people who don't. And that's kind of like one of the underlying motivations in order to professionalize this and one of the key areas that interests me so much.
So I've got so many questions for you. So I watched a little intro video that you recorded to launch the book, and you talked about an engagement you were involved in that was kind of the epiphany moment that said to you, hey, I think I need to document something and go on this multi-year journey. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you found when you started engaging with industry? And I guess maybe I'll give you an additional part to the question. The reason I ask goes back to the introduction, which is a little bit like the help desk and service management community. You think to yourself, what do you mean? We've been doing this for years. Yeah. Why does anyone need to document anything? Surely this is a solved problem. So do you want to talk about what you found when I suppose because you also came into a relatively new industry, I'm curious what your observations were.
I have a consulting background. So as you mentioned, I worked at Pink, and what we did a lot at that time is going to indeed big service organizations, help desks, service desks, and help them professionalize based on standards and best practices. So taking some of the knowledge and proven methodologies and techniques that other organizations all around the world are using in order to do that. And I think it's it's close to around 10 years ago today, where I was tasked with doing a consulting assignment for a big insurance company with offices all around the globe. And what they really tried, the question that they basically asked is, well, we would like to become data-driven, and we would like to start informing most of our decisions based on the different data sources that we collect from all of our branches all across the planet. And it's all a big mess right now, but we would like to, in the end state, our big vision is that we would like to be able to make truly data-driven decisions. And me, as the young consultant at the time, thought, again, let's use kind of like a similar approach. Let's start with, what are the standards in how to set that up, what are the kind of like the procedures that we can look at, and the funny part was, correct. Yeah. And I don't mean just rolling in the technology and the dashboards and the things like that, because that's what most organizations start with. But I was looking at the other perspective, is what are the ways in which we can upskill the people? How can we set up a center of excellence? What are the kind of like data management, data governance procedures that you need? And the funny thing is, Paul, that at that time, and again, we're just talking around a decade ago, there was not a uniform body of knowledge or framework or anything remotely useful that I could use in order to kind of guide that engagement. And obviously there's different smaller pockets that just focus on some very specific point solution. Like for instance, in the data management space, you have some very good initiatives, and in the architecture space, you have some good initiatives. But at that time, I could not find a coherent framework approach. And that's the moment that I thought, well, hey, there is something that is really missing into this domain. And while I'm doing this project, let's kind of start documenting some of the approaches that we took. How do you set up a center of excellence? What are the key considerations in setting up an enterprise big data architecture? Things like that. And that's basically how the ball started rolling. And at that time, I had a friend who works at one of the exam agencies, APMG. He introduced me to the publisher at a Kokum page, and kind of that's how the whole start of this initiative basically went along.
I'm curious. So I'll give you an example from the old iTool world. I remember meeting with a bank once who said, yeah, we've decided we're adopting iTool, but we're going to make one change because we've been doing service management, using our own methodology for a while. And we're going to call incidents problems and problems incidents because that's how we've been doing it. And I looked at them and just went, oh my gosh, you guys are missing the point. Like literally perfectly missing the point.
Absolutely.
I was brilliant. I honestly, it was one of those moments where I had to sit down and think to myself, why am I in this job? I'm curious, as you started to try and document a space which is, let's be clear, has famously innovated over the last 20 years. I mean, I literally wake up in the morning, one morning I woke up and there's this thing called Kafka. Then you wake up a couple of weeks later and you're talking about data lake houses and the technology for that. It is a very fast moving space compared to what I would say is the relatively slow-paced world of incident management. Did you get a lot of pushback from people saying, you can't document this, you can't describe best practices, the space is changing too quickly? Or were people welcoming of what you were doing?
I would say, and luckily that's still the confirmation I get today, is that most people are quite welcome to the idea, because it's kind of like what you're saying, trying to find structure in that fast-pacing space is one of the key challenges, because as you know, and you kind of mentioned some of the buzzwords, it's something new every day. Well, maybe not every day, but at least every 3 months.
Certainly feels like it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a hype cycle around, as you mentioned, data lake houses. We're obviously in this big AI boom right now. You just mentioned things like agentic automation, which is now kind of like the new hype word everyone is diving after. But if you look at the way that data is analyzed and the underlying systems, and then ultimately the way it's stored in databases and the way it's being extracted, then there are very fundamental principles, no matter what kind of fancy algorithm you put on top of that, that should be managed, should be set up, especially within an enterprise context. And that's when we're talking about, measuring the quality of your data, setting up good procedures so that you comply to governance and regulations. So that's more of the data governance space. And as you mentioned, an incident and a problem is a different thing. Same is true for like definitions of data accuracy or data timeliness. Those are kind of key things that, you cannot argue with that. And yet, so many organizations, even the biggest one on the planet, don't have that right. So what I really try to do, very similar to that kind of ITIL space that you're describing in this more fast-paced world, is come up with more, I would say, fundamental principles, procedures on how to establish a proper big data organization in the enterprise. And ultimately, no matter what kind of fancy algorithm or machine learning, predictive analytics tool you put on top of that, ultimately the underlying flow is data. And you need to be able to trust the data that you're looking at. You need to be able to store that in a proper format, take cost considerations into account, deal with all the legal and regulatory stuff, especially if you're operating in multiple countries. So those fundamental key aspects around the way organizations deal with data, I think that that's still very universal, regardless on what the tools are that you're using these days. Those are very, very fundamental principles that every organization should be looking into, at least according to my opinion.
Well, let's talk about your opinion, because you've chunked the corpus of knowledge, the body of knowledge, and best practice down to 6 critical capabilities that you talk about in your, I was going to call it a diamond. It's kind of like is it an octagon or a hexagon or something?
Yes. Very well spotted.
Yeah, so you've got your 6 capabilities. What I found, I mean, that's great. What I found even more interesting is then you've got, I think, like 180 plus diagnostic questions that you ask underneath that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as that has been rolling out, what have you learnt from? By the way, is that a diagnostic that anyone can run, or is that part of your consulting process?
In the book, as you mentioned, I've listed 180 questions. It's kind of like the approach of a self-assessment. So where am I today compared to the 6, I call them macro capabilities, and I've broken them down into 30 kind of like smaller key areas that you should have a look at. And the 180 question list that you're referring to is just a very quick self-assessment. It will take you, let's say, 45 minutes to 1 hour. And the whole purpose of that is to kind of open people's eyes around what are the key things that you should be thinking about. Like, do I have a training and upskilling program for my internal data science staff? Do I use, let's move to algorithms for a second. Do I have a library of algorithms that I actively maintain? And the funny part or the feedback that I've gotten while this has been rolled out is that answering the questions is probably as valuable because a lot of people don't realize that these are key things that you at least should consider. And then if your answer is, this is not something I'm going to do because for our organization it's not relevant, then that's perfectly fine. But what I really try to do with establishing that structure with those 6 capabilities and then those 30 micro ones is those are the key areas that you should at least think about. And what I, in that sense, try to do is provide a bit of a kickstart for key considerations. And that's been the feedback from industry is this is at least a way in which we can start, and now we know what we have, and then we can start building improvements, and we can start to professionalize. The other key thing that I found very, very interesting is that if you look at the model, you see that I've deliberately placed the kind of the data strategy at the core. And the funny part is that the thing that's lacking in most organizations, the most, if you compare maturity across those 6 domains, is a proper data strategy. And I found that that's a very interesting fact. A lot of organizations are doing things, but they are unable to articulate their vision and the reason why they are doing this. And I don't know if you realize this in your own space of work, because I know you talk to a lot of different organizations and people. Everyone these days is saying, I want to do something with AI, or I want to do something with big data. But diving then into the next question I always like to ask is, why? Why would you like to do this? And you will find very few people who are able to articulate a good response to that. It's because everyone is doing it, or because it's going to change the world. But they never are able to articulate that back. Well, in our business, it means we can make so much better decisions, or so much faster, and that's going to save us so much money, or it's going to increase our revenue by so much. So the link between organizational strategy versus the investments needed for data, and as you probably know, data systems, the algorithms, the AI tools, they're far from cheap. So being able to articulate what are you going to do with that result, and is that actually worth it? Is there a clear return on investment on the key investments necessary to facilitate that? That strategy is in my experience, one of the key things that's lacking.
What's your take on the state of agentic?
I think that this is a very interesting development. So basically what we see happening with agentic AI is that we see the world of data science and AI, if I can kind of call that a separate world, is we see that now merging with the world of automation, RPA, and automation of services. So those two are slowly merging together. And the way I always like to explain it is the way that most people use AI these days, and again, let's use ChatGPT as kind of like the example, is you type in something into a prompt, and what then happens is that you copy the output, and then you put that into an email, your Word document, your PowerPoint slides. So there is still, although we're using AI, we are using that on, I would say, a manual basis. So there is this switching between different systems in the way that we use AI. And think about the own work that you're doing. A lot of us are still copying, pasting the outputs of AI between the different systems. So we make a pretty picture, and then we copy that into a PowerPoint slide. Now, what is happening with agentic AI is that we are introducing the power of automation and merging that with AI. And that allows us for a very unique and new feature, is that we can now use the power of AI, but now at scale. So what the robots are obviously very good at is doing things very repetitively and in an automated fashion. So instead of you typing a query into any kind of large language model and copying and pasting the results into, let's say, an email or into a document, what we see happening with agentic AI is that now a robot will do that. And the robot will automatically copy paste the prompt into any kind of system they like. They automatically capture the output. They then put that into the email, and they automatically send it towards, let's say, a customer or anyone that needs support. So what agentic AI really is going to allow us is to leverage the AI capabilities that everyone is so excited about, but now at a scale and a speed that we've never seen before. And the impact of that will be very profound, because let's use marketing for an example. All of us, or most of us, still now we receive messages, and that's like a one-size-fits-all. So big company creates a campaign, that campaign is being pushed to everyone at the same time, regardless on your preferences, who you are, things like that. Now, what agentic AI is able to do is basically tailor that marketing campaign based on my individual preferences. So because we now have that robot involved, we can say, well, based on this customer profile, write a marketing message that's trying to sell product XYZ to this person. And that means that in the back end, we can run thousands or hundreds of thousands of queries in large language models. It means that we can capture the output of those large language models instantly and then send that out to all of our customers. So as a result, every one of us will receive a targeted or personalized message. And that means not just the messaging, it could be in the colors that we like. It could be in the font that we appreciate. It could be based on the buttons that we clicked on. You can even change the layout of the message completely. So that's, I think, why so many organizations are talking about agentic AI these days, is because it really allows us to use that AI capability at a scale that we've never seen before.
When it comes to agentic, forget touch governance. The issue of governance, data governance, of policy really becomes central to everything, because you're putting not even just people in charge where good judgment should be used, or they can kind of look at what other people are doing and adopt the social norms of the company. Governance becomes far more critical rather than less critical. What are your thoughts on data governance, best practices, and what people should be thinking about?
You're bringing up an excellent point. I would even go one step further, Paul, and say that data governance is probably going to be one of the most critical aspects that any organization needs to arrange in the next few years. And the reason is, and this is kind of going full cycle to what you mentioned all the way in the beginning, we start to live in a time of questionable truth. And that means ultimately that we need to have validation of the data sets that we're looking at. And take into account that with generative AI and AI, it becomes worse, right? Because we are generating new data. In our domain, we call that synthetic data. So that means that it's data generated from previous sets. But nobody checks again anymore what the validity or truthfulness or privacy concerns, if we were to live in Europe, are in those data sets. So being able to govern what are the ways in which we're going to deal with customer data, how are we going to protect sensitive data into our systems, what are the data sets that we can trust versus which ones are not, that's going to be a critical area to take under control. And the funny part is that almost no organization that I work with, and I see some of the very large ones across the planet, have or would be comfortable stating at this moment that they have that under control. They do make initiatives and they always have programs ongoing, but if I ask a simple question is, do you trust the data in your organization? Number of people who say yes is very, very limited. So establishing proper data governance is going to be a massive challenge, especially in this new age with the technology capabilities that we have today.
As we wrap up, lots to talk about today, but what do you think the biggest opportunity and the most pressing challenge is in the AI space, or have we just spoken about it?
Well, let me start with the biggest challenge, and let's expand a little bit around that truth part, because the challenge is, we can make all the calculations in the world, we can make the sound advice saying, this is what you should do, and this is where it's going. But if ultimately people don't make the decisions based on the data, then all the analysis that we've done and all of the things that we are have put an effort in is basically to waste. And the trend that I sometimes see that worries me is that we have all of the data that says do A, and people, or as leaders, or whether it's company executives or in other places in the world, people go B. And that's a worrying trend, because it basically means, ultimately I'm going to make a decision that is counter to what the data says. and you have done all the research, but I simply don't care, and I'm going to go a different direction. So I think that's one of the main challenges, is that no matter how good and how truthful and how sure we are that something is the right direction, if leadership or the people who ultimately in charge of those decisions don't use that, then it's basically all for nothing. And I think that's the greatest challenge. So to end on the positive, that's why I started with the challenge first. The opportunities in terms of what data can do in order to help people in whatever walk of life and in whatever stage and in whatever country are also endless. And especially being able to think about increasing, let's say, food production, providing better healthcare, being able to help people become more literate. Very, I would say, fundamental things. I think that we're going to see the biggest impact of these technologies in order to do exactly that. And I think that that's more than possible. I tend to be a positive person, so I think that those opportunities outweigh the challenges every single day. So it's a good thing that these technologies are here. Obviously, they need a bit of governance and a bit of management, but besides that, it's going to open up a world of opportunity for everyone and especially for the world.
I love it. Well, Jan, first, congratulations on the 2 books.
Thanks.
Clearly a labor of love. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. If people want to learn more about you, the books, your podcast, where can they go?
Very recently launched a new initiative in which we're combining some of those efforts, which is called the Data Science Institute, DASKIN. And that's where you'll be able to find a lot of the things that we talked about.
Well, that is a wrap. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jan, for being a guest on the pod today. We'd love to have you back. Thank you again to Cloudera for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast podcast. And thanks again for tuning in on the radios that you're not using. So I don't know why you're tuning in. I suppose you... Anyway, if you're 50 years old like me, that'll all make sense. And if you're a young person, you'll be wondering what a radio is. With that, we'll see you all next week. Stay home. Bye, bro.